So picking up where we left off in the first video, I'd like to recommend to you the book, The Quest for Truth, Answering Life's Inescapable Questions by Dr. Leroy Fourlines. He was formerly a professor at what was called Free Will Baptist Bible College. Now it's called Welch College in Nashville. He's retired, and really this is an update of an older systematic theology textbook that he put out years ago. But in this one, he has some introductory stuff on postmodernism that I think, if you have trouble understanding the difference between the modern world and postmodern world, consult this book. And he is very careful to say that the reason postmodernism has developed is as a reaction to the failures of modernism. So remember this: if we complain about how bad the postmodern world is, let's be careful not to be tacitly arguing that the modern world is exactly what it should have been, that we need to go back to that. In many ways, it was godless. In many ways, it was fraught with error, just as the postmodern world is. So we know we can't go back to that time, and we don't necessarily want to go back to that time. But as Christians, we have to work in a world where truth is not assumed anymore. So one of the things that Leroy Fourlines does in his book is an excellent job of distinguishing between the usefulness of modernist thought and the places where it is weak. And he says this: modernism was really good at answering what he calls the lower story questions. The lower story questions about math and mechanics and the physical sciences. In other words, the kinds of answers that science brings to us, lower story questions that are asked, modernism is really good at answering those. What it's not good at are answering the inescapable questions of life. How do we know God? Are there universal truths? What is moral knowledge, and how do we have it? Religious knowledge. What is the meaning and purpose of life? Ultimately, the modernist framework is incapable of answering that question. So the upper story questions can only be answered from a different reference point. And modernism does not offer it. And neither does postmodernism. So if modernism had its truths, but was incapable of answering these upper story questions, postmodernism doesn't allow for absolute truth at all, or at least it behaves as if it doesn't. Let me throw in this one fact. I said we all live in a postmodern world in the sense we're all postmodernist, and in that sense we know that there's no such thing as news. We don't just look at the news. We want to know the source from which the news came, because we're skeptical of motives and we're skeptical of their ability to truly get at the truth. So if, as postmodernists, we are going to live in a world like that, we also live in a world where the modern world is very much still alive. So we still go to doctors. We still drive cars that are built on engineering that assumes absolute truth, that assumes that the scientific method works, that we can find truth that way. And so it's not as if we've completely abandoned the modernist framework, but that when it comes to major claims of life, people are more and more skeptical of anyone's ability to proclaim the truth. Well, what I want to do in the remaining minutes of this video is discuss the need for absolute truth. Let's do it this way. You may or may not recognize this plant. It's actually a fruit that can be procured in Southeast Asia, and it's called a durian, D-U-R-I-A-N. And a durian is a unique food in that for a certain segment of the population, probably 40% or so, it is one of the most delicious and sweetest fruits that you could ever eat. It's incredibly good. But for the remainder, we'll say maybe 60%, it smells like death. It tastes so horrible. And so it'd be the equivalent, if you tried to eat it, for most people, of trying to eat garbage. So it's really hard to fathom, but this one fruit is either a delicacy or it's inedible, depending on the person. In fact, if you've ever flown in South Korea before, you might even have seen they'll have these signs posted on the in the airline. It'll say no smoking, no eating or drinking, no flammable goods, and no durians. Don't bring them on board because it'll make some people sick. But then to other people, it'll taste delicious. And this is kind of what I'd call the postmodern fruit. Okay, it's not good or bad. It depends on the person. And of course, this is more of a joke, but it leads to the idea of kind of the postmodern quandary. It's kind of like the story of the 6 men and the elephant. People are fond of quoting this. It actually started off as a poem. But this story about when 6 men discovered the elephant, and they say this is like religion. So you probably know the story. So the 6 blind men come across this elephant, and they all think they know what an elephant is. So they're blind men, and they're all grasping different parts of the elephant. So, for instance, the one who grabs the trunk says, well, the elephant is like a big, thick rope, long and windy. Another one who's holding a tusk, no, he says, an elephant is like a long, sharp stick. Another holds the ear and says, no, an elephant is like a large leaf. And you've heard this before, all the way back to the one who holds the tail. No, he's just a stringy rope. And we say, well, this is the problem. We're all like these blind men. And when we think we know the truth, we think we know the right religion or something, we're only grasping one part of it, and we can't really see the whole thing. And the problem with this analogy is, of course, in the 6 blind men and the elephant, where is the 7th man? So if you count 6 here, where's the 7th? Well, the 7th one is you or me. We're standing outside and we see what they don't see. So we assume that we are the all-seeing eye and we know the truth. We know the truth, that what the elephant really is, but they don't because they're blind. So even in this analogy, we assume an unseen truth teller, someone who knows what an elephant really is. We can't escape this fact. Absolute truth is reality. There is such a thing as absolute truth. This might seem overly simplistic, but to me it's very powerful. If you ask a person, do they believe in absolute truth? Okay? If they say yes, well, sure. I mean, that's what we're arguing. But if they say no, then that means they are saying there is no absolute truth. That in itself is a statement of absolute truth. It is a self-defeating statement. So we don't have the option of believing in, or whether or not there is absolute truth. We can choose not to believe in it, but there must be absolute truth. The book talks about, well, what is truth, and we'll go over in just a moment the different qualities of truth that our authors discuss. I just want to quickly go over the different theories of truth. And ultimately, we're going to wind up with this top one here. Truth is what corresponds with fact or reality. That's called the correspondence view. But first, let's consider the alternatives. The pragmatic theory of truth says truth is what works. So that might change from time to time and season to season. We'll do what works. And so right and wrong is determined by what works at the moment. But you can see, of course, there are major problems with this, because what works for one person might not work for the other. I mean, the Nazis had a pragmatic theory of truth, that it's right to kill some people because of their race and wrong to kill other people because of their race. And depending on what race you are, it might work for you or might not work for you. And so ultimately you can see this is an unacceptable theory of truth. The empiricist theory of truth is based on the idea that truth is what we can sense. And so it's based on our 5 senses. But of course, there is a problem with this, because there are many true things that we can't prove using our 5 senses. I also teach math. I teach math at Amridge, and I've taught geometry for many years. We don't actually offer that class here. But in geometry, what we call Euclidean geometry or high school geometry, it's thousands of years old. And it's built off of one major assumption, which might seem to be very straightforward. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now, did you know that that statement can't be directly proven? What I mean by that is there is no mathematical proof for the fact that there are the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. You can prove that indirectly, but you can't prove it directly. All of Euclidean geometry and much of what we learn in math classes is built on something that we can't prove. And so we can't, with our senses, go out and know this for a fact. The empiricist theory of truth ultimately can't discover all truth. A rationalist theory of truth is similar to that, is what can be proved by reason. And again, reason, while it can be trusted, it can't be ultimately trusted. Kurt Gödel, who was, or actually it's more like Gödel, was one of the greatest mathematical minds in history, taught in Germany and in America. And he offered up what he called his paradox, which is this. The following sentence is true, this statement is unprovable. Okay, so the following sentence is true, this statement is unprovable. So let's think of our options. Well, first, is the statement true? Well, let's suppose that it's not. Let's suppose it's false. Then its opposite would be true, right? So it would be false. And the statement would be provable. So if it's provable, it must be true if we assume that, according to the rationalist theory of truth, all truth is provable. But of course there's a problem with this. The truth of the statement is provable, but the statement itself is unprovable. So we have the problem that the rationalist theory of truth is ultimately unable to tell us the truth, because some things can't be proved by reason and they're still true. The fourth one is the one to me that's most appealing outside of the correspondence theory of truth. It's the coherence theory of truth, which says truth is what is consistent or in harmony within a set of ideas. So imagine that the coherence theory is like a web where one fact doesn't exist in isolation to the others. One fact is instead based on other facts, and so it's connected to this large web. And so truth is true within a larger set of truths. And to me, I don't think this is anti-Christian, but I think it ultimately falls short. The correspondence theory of truth says truth is what corresponds with fact or reality. That's what we generally assume. And so when we say to kids, tell the truth, we want them to tell what corresponds with fact or reality. Now, humans aren't always capable of telling the truth in the right way. But it is the case that we expect people to tell the truth, and that we expect them to understand this correspondence theory of truth. This has always been the case. This is a quote. I know you can't see it at the bottom of your screen, so I'll tell you where to get it. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, wrote, "To say of what is, and that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. So that he who says anything that it is, or that it is not, will say either what is true or what is false." That is the correspondence theory of truth.